Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to A Cup of Hope with Hope Against Trafficking and the Michigan Abolitionist Project. Today, wherever you're watching, you have the opportunity to submit questions to our panel by typing those questions in the comment pane. You might send in your questions at any time if you have any during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the session. And also feel free to add comments and let us know that you're here. We'd love to see you. Today's panelists include Hannah McPeak, the Education Director for Hope Against Trafficking, and Emily Johnson, the Program Coordinator at Michigan Abolitionist Project. Today's special guest panelist is Margaret Peg Talbert, PhD. She has spent her entire career in the nonprofit sector, primarily working with foundations. She's been engaged in anti-human trafficking work as a funder and an advocate, not as a direct service provider since the 1990s. She currently is a member of MAP Ann Arbor and the MHTTF and Resources Subcommittee of the Michigan Human Trafficking Commission. Today's topic is the decriminalization of sex buying and what's in store for Washtenaws' future. The Washtenaw County Prosecutor's Office has published a new policy decriminalizing sex buying. Now, what does this mean for Michigan residents? Countless studies from around the globe have shown that wherever sex buying is legal, there's an increase in demand for commercial sex, which leads to an increase in sex trafficking. This means more and more vulnerable individuals, including youth of all ages, will be targeted for sexual exploitation by means of force, fraud, and/or coercion to meet the rising demands of sex buyers. Contrary to claims of increased safety, this policy now creates a dangerous precedent for Ann Arbor, a college town of over 80,000 students, and potentially all of Michigan, as we are at greater risk of becoming a sex tourism hub for buyers and traffickers nationwide. We urge you to join our live discussion today as we consider the research and explore the equality model, the only true progressive and survivor-informed solution to preventing and ending sex trafficking. To start off, we're going to go ahead by playing a video on to highlight the issue.
Prosecutor causing quite a backlash.
It's going to be a hotspot for traffickers to bring women from other states.
And what about the location?
It was really shocking, actually. And for a policy like that to be implemented in a county that has two major universities and a large LGBTQ community.
That backlash coming from those who live in the area as well as people across the world who are trying to fight human trafficking.
They're concerned, according to studies, when prostitution is legal, sex trafficking tended to increase, not decrease, and they're worried that Ann Arbor could become the next Amsterdam.
Ann Arbor, tucked along the Huron River, this bustling university town is filled with culture. A downtown scene with restaurants and pubs. But could that scene change now that consensual sex work in the county is allowed?
Thus, by the sheer fact that you've got a college town, you end up with young women and girls. And in this moment in time, we know that people are more vulnerable than ever.
Lauren Hirsch is the National Director of World Without Exploitation.
So we are essentially giving sex buyers a free pass and feeding young, vulnerable people right into the belly of the sex trade.
Hirsch says while there are individuals doing sex work voluntarily, that's a small minority, and warns what happens when sex work is legalized.
Sex buying is legal. What we know for sure is that there's a spike in the demand for commercial sex. So think of a place like Amsterdam, which has become a hub for the sex trade.
I'm an adult survivor of sexual exploitation, and I was trafficked from the age of 21 to 27.
Bridget Robarge is now an advocate for human trafficking survivors, using her energy to fight this new policy.
There isn't really much of a difference between pro-sex work and trafficked persons. Exploitation is exploitation.
Chrissy Hemphill is also an advocate. She just wrote this op-ed titled, "There's Nothing Harmless About Sex Buying."
Just made me think about the massive amount of vulnerable people in that county and how scary it is that he's no longer going to prosecute people who are purchasing sex.
The defenders brought these concerns straight to the Washtenaw County Prosecutor's office.
Let me be clear on this. We are going after human traffickers. We are prosecuting predatory pimps. What we are not doing is seeking criminal charges for consensual sex work. And that is because we know that when sex work takes place in the shadows, it renders folks that are engaged in that activity more vulnerable to sexual assault, more vulnerable to physical assault.
As far as the concern for the two college towns that sit in Washtenaw County, U of M and Eastern, and what could this message of decriminalization of sex work mean? The prosecutor says he's not worried.
We are not authorizing or condoning commercial sex here in Washtenaw County. There's going to be no brothels. We will shut those down. There's going to be no, streets like you have in Amsterdam, where folks are openly sold for sex.
Still, there are worries, and his opponents vow to keep on fighting and exposing the risk of this new policy.
His policy just interrupts all the work that we have been doing to get to this point. And he doesn't understand it as well. I think he's being misinformed.
Now, opponents go on to say legalizing sex buyers has been tried and is a failed experiment. In Nevada, where prostitution is legal, for example, the state actually has the highest rates of illegal sex trade in the nation. I did post the prosecutor's new policy along with that op-ed that Chrissy Hempel wrote on our website, so you can read more about both sides of the argument.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our panelists now.
Thank you so much, Kendra. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We have a very important discussion ahead. If you've been following us on social media, you may have seen and heard about this, following it in the news. It's definitely a very big topic at the moment. And so that is what we're going to do today. We're going to kind of pull it apart just a little bit and answer some basic questions about the policy and clear up any misconceptions of this consensual sex work and if it's safer, et cetera, et cetera. So Peg Talbert, we are very excited to have you with us today. Peg is actually a community group leader of our MAP Ann Arbor community group, and she is excellent. So we are so happy to have you here. Also a resident of Ann Arbor. So this is happening in your own city. So could you maybe tell us a little bit? So the policy directive was published in January. So do you want to give maybe like a brief overview of when it came out, our reactions, maybe some things that we tried to do right away in his response, Ellie Savitt's response?
Sure. Yes, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm sorry for the visual quality here, but I'm on the road and not obviously in a production studio. So anyway, thank you all for bearing with. As Emily said, I live in Ann Arbor. I've been involved in a variety of aspects of anti-human trafficking, primarily, as was stated, as a funder, not in direct services. So imagine my surprise one Saturday in January when there was a little article in the Detroit Free Press saying consensual sex work approved in or proposed or something like that in Washtenaw County. And I went, what? So I got on, and it turned out there was a new policy directive from our brand new prosecuting attorney. He had only taken office a week or two before. And within about that first week or so, there were at least 8 policies released, this being number 8. Some of the other policies are had to do with no cash bail anymore, not pushing ICE deportations, things that would be, which I would support. But lo and behold, we get to this new policy called Policy Regarding Sex Work. And the nugget of it is, although it takes many, many pages to describe it, is that consensual sex work will in no way be prosecuted. So it would become legal. Now, the prosecuting attorney still has to follow all state policy and laws related to human trafficking, both sex trafficking as well as labor trafficking. And the prosecuting attorney, on the flip side, can choose his interpretation of how he's going to comply with that law. It does not have to be approved by our county commissioners. It does not have to be put up for a vote or whatever. So he can decree that consensual sex work is fine by me. He will add to his credit that he's still going to prosecute human trafficking. But the big, big question is, how do you do that? And his policy, in my view, did not reflect much awareness of the dynamics of human trafficking, particularly sex trafficking. And it does, in my view, seem to be a solution for a problem that I did not understand. He will say that sex workers have been asking him for this kind of protection. And we all agree that victim survivors should not be prosecuted. But the difference is, those of us who support the equality model feel that buyers and sellers should still face criminal penalties, and that both of those things can happen. You can decriminalize for the survivor victims, but you can hold those buying and selling accountable. And in fact, human trafficking laws in our state do hold those people responsible, but you have to be able to prove trafficking. And in my view, that's the biggest fallacy to this. If I am the survivor victim and I feel that I'm doing this for my own volition, or I'm doing it because it's my way, I'm being coerced, or it's how I'm protecting my grandma, or it's how I get a roof over my head, or it's how I get money that I desperately need. Am I going to say, when confronted by an officer of the law, that this was anything but consensual? Because if I say it's not consensual, then there's going to be legal law enforcement. I will be perhaps at even more risk by the pimp, from the pimp or the buyer. I mean, there just seems to me to be no thoughtful plan about how then you make the cases for legal enforcement. The other, in my view, biggest weakness of Savitt's policy is that you have to wait for the crime to be committed, so that there's no opportunity for intervention. There's no opportunity to protect the vulnerable so that they don't have to get sucked into human trafficking. You have to wait for the crime to be committed in order to have the intervention. And let alone, there were no resources. There's no plan of operation for how you might protect the vulnerable. There are no resources for victims who necessarily want to get out of the life but don't know how to do that. There are so many fallacies, uninformed and naive, in my view, for this kind of a policy. So I'll just stop. Hannah, jump in, or if there are any questions out there, we could take it from there. Emily, you want to add more?
That was a terrific overview. And in the next 20, 30 minutes or so, we'll kind of pull some of those pieces apart and look deeper into the things that you touched on. First and foremost, I do want to make sure everyone listening today, we also wanted to discuss just what are the general links between sex trafficking and prostitution. So he's saying that he's decriminalizing those who are consensually working in the sex industry. But really, what are the links between prostitution and sex trafficking? And how does one even really pull them apart, or know the difference between the two. So who wants to?
Well, I can certainly say that prostitution and human trafficking, or being sex trafficked, are very much perpetuating one another. Like prostitution perpetuates the issue of trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
What happens when it's really built on inequality, right? It's built on racial and sexual and gender and income. I mean, it's a very violent industry. It's an industry that perpetuates gender biased violence. It perpetuates abuse and exploitation. Both are sexual exploitation. Both are. And when you think of somebody who are they prostituting themselves? Are they being prostituted? What's happening is that they're being purchased for something that is inherently a degradation of the sense of self. And force, coercion, fraud can be hidden very easily. Mm-hmm. Because those lines are, and the whole issue of consent is very gray. Those lines are very gray, just like the lines of what prostitution and human trafficking are very gray. Mm-hmm. And because they cross paths so easily and so often, just that the idea of sex trafficking and prostitution in and of itself they're not separate entities. They're really not. Does that make sense? I don't even know if what I'm saying.
No, I think so. Yeah, and I was going to say the whole, power control cycle, the trauma bonding. Again, somebody may not see themselves as a victim. They may feel as though it's totally of their volition. Mm-hmm. But that denies what all kinds of research has shown about, about the realities of sex work, which is that it is, as you said, Hannah, incredibly degrading, unequal, built on violence, and mm-hmm. no respect. I mean.
And when you think about the vulnerabilities of like prostitution and human trafficking, they're extremely common. They're similar, right? Abuse, financial instability, poverty, runaways, homelessness, homeless youth, the LGBTQ community, being female, racial minorities, the marginalized, economic inequalities. I mean, it's when you describe the circumstances around both, they're really one and the same. I mean, if it looks like a turtle and walks like a turtle, it is. I mean,
Right.
Some say that you are either trafficked by a pimp or trafficked by the system, that there are these systematic inequalities and vulnerabilities, poverty, homelessness that kind of force you into the sex industry, force some into the sex industry because they don't have any other choices or options. Sometimes they have a lack of education, access to education, living in poverty. So it is the choice.
Right. And as Lauren Hirsch said in the Karen Drew piece from World Without Exploitation, yes, it is possible that you might be a sex worker who is making a huge amount of money and is very selective about clients and is very safe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that would be so rare. And the realities between the more typical experience and that experience is so huge that mm-hmm. you just can't pretend, oh, that's how it'll turn out. Because the King County in the state of Washington, in which sits Seattle, has done some very good research to show that, the amount of violence, of rape, of even serious bodily injury that those engaged in sex trafficking and sex work experience is huge. I mean, far more typical than atypical. Mm-hmm. And you know, it's just, and if you were somebody who started out with much power or control in your life, this is not going to give you more. It's only going to give you less.
Right. And I think when you look at the research, and historically speaking, consistently over and over again across the board, whether it be international data or even national data, it's consistent. The evidence is there that sex work is inherently violent and inherently feeds on vulnerabilities that are common. And I don't know how you can deny that. I don't know how you can ignore all of that data, because that is something we do have. So it's like, it's sort of mind, it's like, it doesn't come together. There's something else is going on. I mean, that just doesn't come together.
Well, Savin has found, I mean, he did do research, or had someone do research for him, and found a study in France, which did go more toward an equality model, that resulted, over the period of study, there were 10 sex workers who were killed, and he attributes it to the equality model, as opposed to the inherent violence of people who buy sex. It just happened to be recorded. There also was an article in a British journal saying that this would help public health, and one from the UN. But those reports had to do with condoms. And if it's, you know, if sex work is legal in his mind, then you can access public health, you know, resources like condoms. Well, that one of those studies was done around HIV. It really wasn't done around the dynamics of, you know, of sex trafficking.
Sex work, and
I mean, he's, you know, he's based his policy on some facts, but they are, and
they're not.
No, they're not consistent.
And I've heard testimonies from survivors who have lived in Nevada and have actually worked in the legalized sex industry. And when sex buying and selling becomes legal, the state owns your body. That you think that you have more, you know, body autonomy, like I have, you know, these are my choices. You think it's this false sense of empowerment, because really the state, if you're working in a brothel, the state is the one who, I mean, your body is in essence an object for someone to purchase. And so it's advertised as an object. You have no personal identity. And yeah, with the condoms, so you may be able to force someone to wear a condom, or you may be able to enforce that, but these women have to be STD checked like several times a week, and do the men are sex buyers ever tested before they come in and buy sex? But I don't want to get too off topic, because that is legalization, but just, I mean, that exists in Nevada, and Nevada has experienced some serious backlash and increased rates of human trafficking.
Their numbers are not showing any evidence, I don't feel like, or enough evidence of it being beneficial at all.
And so the harms inherent to prostitution, I think we can agree that prostitution is not a job like any other. Even Elie Savitt sees and understands that this is a dangerous profession. That's why he wants to decriminalize it, so that women will feel safer, like they're more willing to report violence at the hands of sex buyers, traffickers, if this is decriminalized, because they no longer fear that they're going to be you know, penalized and charged with some prostitution felony charge. So they'll be more likely to report violence to law enforcement. But I mean, so even Elie Savitt agrees that this is a dangerous profession, because why? I mean, what other profession are you going to the law enforcement left and right reporting that you've been assaulted or raped or beaten or almost ran over? And there's tons of research out there on.
And the point is, the equality model would make it just as easy or easier for a victim survivor to report because
Absolutely.
that's part of the
Yeah.
model. They're not
Right.
held legally responsible. So I think, again, we all agree that,
Mhm.
you know, that victim survivors deserve protection,
Mhm.
should be able to seek it as they need to. But again, the reality of when and where and why or how you might do that, you know, you have to listen to survivor voices. And that was another piece of his research, is he did not consult with survivors of sex trafficking. When we did have a preliminary Zoom meeting with him in February, there were probably, I don't know, Emily, I think you coordinate, but I'm going to say at least 50 or so participants from Michigan and even outside of Michigan. And there were some of us who were advocates, but the vast majority were survivors. And their stories and their commitment to a different policy, their four-square stance against legalizing sex work was just, you know, powerful and heartbreaking. And yet and this meeting went on for, I'm going to say, an hour and a half to 2 hours. And I know that Savitt, to his credit, allowed people to speak, but I don't think he actually listened. And just yesterday, somebody from our groups, you know, had reported to him that he didn't listen, and he said just yesterday that actually he did. He has revised his policy to remove the word knowingly. So originally, the policy, I could get it for you exactly, said something like, anyone who knowingly consents can be, you know, is off the hook. And so he's removed the word knowingly. So anyone who consents is off the hook. So it's like, you know, 2 hours of stories from survivors, and that's the one change you made. I mean, it's and really, we just found that out yesterday, you know, 6 weeks after this meeting. And let me put in the first plug, but not the last plug, for anybody who happens to be listening. There is going to be a town hall about this situation and policy on April 13th at 7 p.m. There will be a variety of both survivor leaders as well as experts in the equality model discussing it, and we invite all of you to join in. And you can do it. You must pre-register, and you can do that through the MAP website. So I know Emily will remind you many times, but let me encourage everybody to try and attend that Zoom meeting as well. Zoom at 7 p.m. on April 13th.
Thanks, Peg. Yeah, we'll have those details at the end too. I also want to mention, thank you for all that, Peg. That was really good. So the sex buyers, I know we talk a lot about who are the victims of human trafficking, who are these women, men, children. I mean, who are these people who go into sex work or the victims of human trafficking? So, but who are the sex buyers? And so there's also been extensive research on those who buy sex. And as you saw in the video clip, there's an organization called World Without Exploitation that's actually been advocating for the equality model all throughout the United States, and several states have their own campaigns and are working towards it as well. So, but we've been working with World Without Exploitation, and I just wanted to show, because we don't have any survivors on with us today, but survivor voices and testimonies are the most powerful thing. So I did want to show a quick clip just from a survivor's perspective of who really are the sex buyers in this industry. So Kendra, if you could play the clip. This is a webinar from World Without Exploitation. These are all survivor leaders.
Buyers are primarily white men, educated, more than 50% of the time married, another 8 to 10% in a relationship. There's usually children, at least, 1 or 2 children, and they're employed, and usually not bad jobs. The estimate, I think, Demand Abolition's report, one of them shows that, average salary $100,000 or more. So we're talking about buyers, the men, primarily, as I said, white men. And the reason there's nothing wrong with white men, this isn't about bashing white men. We're talking about disposable income. They just happen to have it. Okay. So we're talking about those with disposable income who have the ability to prey on the vulnerabilities of those who are homeless, and as mentioned before, those involved in prostitution are homeless. A lot of the time, living in poverty, lack of education, and all of these things that our society has let us down with. And in those situations, society is the pimp, in my opinion, because it's not doing its job to make sure that an individual's vulnerabilities don't make them easy prey to those who have disposable income. Before I say about the accountability, I just want to remind you that they're not just buying access to a woman or girl's body, or a man or a boy, or someone who is in the LGBTQI community. They're buying a piece of a person's soul. Each time they make that transaction, they take away and they chip away at the humanity and the integrity and the dignity of a person who was born priceless. They make a conscious decision to trade money for paid rape. Okay, so they should be held accountable because they're the cause of the problem. This is a business transaction to them. This is a business model. We're talking all the different estimates. The dollar value of the commercial sex trade isn't the point. The point is human beings have no actual dollar value that can be placed on them and their humanity. So they should be held accountable because they've chosen to remove, with a business transaction, the humanity of someone that actually looks like them. They don't have to be white, they don't have to be Black, they don't have to be Hispanic, Asian, Indigenous, whatever it happens to be, they are a human being. So they make a decision to let their sexual appetite remove the dignity and humanity of another human being. And so it's up to them to pay for the harm, the many different levels of harm, not just the physical violence. We're talking torture, whether they actually ever beat a person, inflict physical violence. Torture does not have to include, beating someone bloody. Torture is making someone, if you look at the definition, torture is making someone do something they really do not want to do. And trust me, people who are involved in prostitution do not want to do it. They have to do it because they are missing the ability on some level to meet their basic needs otherwise.
Well, that is powerful.
Yeah, that's Marion Hatcher, a survivor who actually works at the Sheriff's Department in Chicago and around trafficking issues. And she is extremely well-versed and articulate about her life and what she knows about trafficking. So
I would also add that I think she referred to a research report that was done by Demand Abolition. That's that report called Who Buys Sex? Yes. And where they surveyed over 8,000 men from all around the United States. And they even include quotes from some men who buy sex. And these beliefs that they have about the women working in the industry are almost, it's despicable, the things that they say about these women. But a lot of them were found quoted saying that if I purchase this, she she has no right. She can't say no. Like, I'm paying for, if I give you money, like, you have to do whatever I say. Like, I'm paying for this. So really, where is the consent if money is involved in the transaction? You're essentially, it's paid rape because, yeah.
I mean, you might have agreed to the transaction, but then once it starts happening, now you're like stuck and you don't agree. So again, just to continue to perpetuate that fact that, or, you know, reinforce the fact that where does consent begin and end?
Right, and to bring this back to Savitt's policy, so as in that same video later on, Rebecca Bender says, you know, I was choosing the life, sort of, but once I opened that door to go in, you never knew what was behind it. And that's where the consent ended. I mean, if you might want the male to use a condom, but if he doesn't want to, guess what? It's probably not going to happen. You know, you might have thought you were consenting to one kind of sex act and you end up in something that is incredibly different or threatening or whatever. It's the purchase is, you know, the purchase is the power. And once bought, there's no power left. So it's you know, a human tragedy of the greatest.
And in that and in that space, no legal law enforcement is going to do anything. I mean, it's not going to do anything. You know, the society has created this like, I'm closing my eyes to this. We're going to make this legal so we can protect you, but it's like a total cop out.
Exactly. And everybody agrees, including, I believe, Ellie Savitt, that we can never prosecute our way out of this problem. These cases are incredibly complicated. You know, at the best, it's a year to 2 years in the court system. It's very hard for survivors to perhaps be around to continue their testimony. It's, you know, post-traumatic stress. It's just, you know, they're plea bargains, and it's just not, even if the legal case can be made, it's, you know, it's after the fact. The damage has been done, and there's almost never going to be a kind of resolution that can truly, you know, through the legal system, truly heal the survivor at that point. And again, I find Savitt's policy incredibly naive about the dynamics of you know, how it happens. He refers to it as the world's oldest profession. You know, the crime without a victim. I mean, these are the old stereotypes, and it allows some buyers to think, oh, this is fine. You know, I've got money, that person wants it. They've got something I want. You know, it's all equal, and that is a rationalization at best. It's a death sentence at worst. So.
So when we talk about like what are the concerns associated with Ellie Savitt's policy to decriminalize consensual sex work, I mean, we've mentioned several concerns, but how will law enforcement determine if a situation is truly consensual? I mean, you're just in essence going off one person's word from the other, and women historically are not always believed. And law enforcement, like, just because you have this policy doesn't mean you change the mindset of the law enforcement. Law enforcement have been charging women with, you know, arresting women as prostitutes for the longest. So their mindset is still going to take some time to change. No consent once money is exchanged. She can't say no. So really, what is consent? As well as victims of human trafficking often do not self-identify as victims of human trafficking. I think Peg touched on this earlier. Many would not report the situation, even if they did know they were the victim of human trafficking, or if they experienced violence, because the fear from their trafficker oftentimes is greater than any other consequence. So, I mean, traffickers are definitely discouraging them to report anything to law enforcement. So what are the harms that come from decriminalizing the sex industry in general? It normalizes this idea of buying and selling human beings. You know, we're using and treating human beings and bodies as a commodity. Creates greater demand for commercial sex. So maybe, Peg, if you want to pull apart that, what happens when you decriminalize sex work?
Sure.
What does that do to demand?
Yeah, well, it's the old supply and demand. So if what's happened in Vegas or other countries around the world is, you know, any example, what will happen is then more and more buyers come out because they want it and they can get it and they don't have to fear an arrest or whatever. They and then that means that you need a bigger supply, because if demand goes up, you know what the other side is, you want supply to go up. So what that means is pimps then start looking for more and more vulnerable individuals who can be groomed and pulled into sex work. And, you know, it's the targeting of the vulnerable that is the thing to, I think, truly fear. Because how do you protect, especially when there's, you know, you've lost the lever of the law to try and intervene. And so it's, you know, it's just such a huge issue. You know, the other piece is that you know, you think about the example to youth. Okay, your cousin or the person down the street or whatever, all of a sudden is driving around in a fancy car, or, you know, is having healthy meals or whatever it might be. I mean, well, how did this happen? Oh, guess what? All I have to do is this, you know. It's
especially in a college town.
Yeah, in a college town. And I would refer people who are interested, it's a tad off topic, but there's a phenomenon called sugaring, which has been rampant on college campuses.
We did an episode on that.
Yes, exactly. And so if you don't know about it, find out about it, because it's a particular issue on college campuses where you have educated, usually women, young women who may have extraordinary financial needs to pay tuition or whatever, or in a place like New York City, they may have incredible cash needs just to be able to take cabs or Ubers or whatever. Or so anyway, you have a population that may be doing it out of consent to say, okay, great, you know, for $1,000, I'll do this tonight, and then I'll, you know, be done. I'll pay my monthly tuition or my rent or whatever else. But, and granted, that's consent and maybe it works, but it is such a slippery slope. And where it can end up is, you know, could be the worst possible place in the world. And I think many of those who have participated in hindsight would say, what was I thinking? You know, and they're kind of the lucky ones. So, you know, again, in a college town like Ann Arbor, with University of Michigan, Ypsilanti has Eastern. There are 3 other higher ed institutions in the county. You know, you think about football weekends, 100,000.
I'm just thinking about frat houses.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, you guys, let's get a couple girls. And who knows?
And when you think about it too, like, it's going to be damaging to the community at large. I certainly, if I have a daughter college age, I would not want them going to U of M. I mean, it's a good school. It's a great institute, but I would never, ever, I would not send my daughter, my kids there. I mean, and that's sad. I mean, but that's I mean, most parents who, you know, you just think, oh my gosh, you know, this just perpetuates it. If we're looking at 2 colleges, U of M's not going to win, and that's a detriment to the community. And I wonder if universities or colleges are stepping up, or if anybody is anything, I don't know who else in the community is really stepping up, but I just think that it can cause a detriment in so many different ways,
And U of M has worked very hard to have a very strong sexual assault awareness program, with training on every level, with penalties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the dynamics are not the same, but there are some huge areas of overlap in terms of a loss of power and control, and the circumstances, which may or may not involve alcohol or drugs, which may or may not involve just bad judgment or mistakes. But I mean, the university has tried to be very strong in their response to that, and again, work on the prevention side, not on the as well as the after the crime's been committed side. But you have to think, as you just said, Hannah, this is not going to help. So,
So like, when we're talking about the harms that come from decriminalizing the sex industry, there's this false sense of safety. He said, if you criminalize sex work, you're pushed to move to the streets, and it's more dangerous working conditions. But as we know, the harms of prostitution can never be regulated away. By decriminalizing or legalizing the sex trade, you actually condone violence against those who are marginalized. Violence is the norm, not the exception to the rule. Often at the hands of sex buyer requests and sex buyers.
And it's not being pushed to the street, because where it's being pushed to is the internet. And the fact that he'd even say push to the streets is, again, it's just naivete. So at best, it's naivete. I mean, I don't know what is really behind it, but it's, it's all on the internet now and cell phones. So.
We have a false sense of women empowerment, false sense of body autonomy. The sex industry is a system fueled by racism, income inequality, gender inequality, misogyny. It thrives on power imbalance. The most privileged person purchasing the most marginalized. You cannot find empowerment within a system of oppression. It fosters gender inequality. That demand abolition report on who buys sex. They say buyers and non-buyers hold strikingly different views on masculinity and sex buying. Non-buyers are much more likely than active ones to say that purchasing someone for sex involves treating females as objects, and those actions exploit others. Active buyers are very likely to say they are just guys being guys, taking care of their needs. So fosters gender inequality. And many in these reports, many men who have bought sex in the past wish to stop. So wish to stop as in that they are unable to stop. So it's also fueling sex addiction. In a lot of cases, unfortunately, you have this wide open access to pornography online. And now when you decriminalize sex work, these men now have the ability to go take what they watch on the screen and act it out. And as we know, the porn industry is heavily saturated with violence and just harmful, degrading sexual acts that no woman or partner would feel respected or loved. And so who else can you do that with? Well, a prostitute, because she can't say no. My wife won't do it with me, but I can go get a prostitute because she has to do whatever I want once I pay her.
Okay. The other harm it does is it harms the buyer. It harms that human being. It harms their relationship with themselves, with the world, and with their wives, with their spouses, partners, with their and with their kids. It destroys that person. It destroys them. It changes their brain activity. It changes in a very negative way, and it increases depression. It increases, everything that's related to addiction, and all of the issues that revolve around that is very much what happens, except what you're doing is you're destroying another human life while you're destroying your own in this activity. And there's this quote that I'm going to look for it real quick, by Demand Abolition, that 1 in 5 men who have never bought before could envision buying sex in the future if the circumstances were right. So not only are we, but it's like we're opening up the door to basically to the slaughter, right? They don't know it. It's like cows lined up that are going to be slaughtered. And that like literally is what I see happening when you open the doors here, when you're decriminalizing the sex industry. It just opens the door for people to go in and get just absolutely wreck their lives.
And why would you,
that's literally what's happening.
Why would you want to do that when sex buyers are saying that this is something that they wish they wouldn't have done, but now they can't get out? And even the women, that a majority of women say if they had the opportunity to leave the sex industry, if they had better opportunities, that they would leave the sex industry. So why? Who thinks that this is a good idea? You're just.
Yeah, it's like find me somebody who would actually choose to do it if they were given another opportunity to make a good living and to have resources, that they would actually choose sex
and have
work.
a normal life. I mean, these women disassociate. I mean, they've got crazy levels of PTSD just to cope and numb with the stuff that they endure on a daily basis, et cetera, et cetera. So we got about 7 more minutes. We did say that we were going to talk a little bit more just about the equality model.
Yes.
In essence, it is a 3-pronged approach. And who wants to take a stab at giving a...
Well, I'd say the 3 prongs would be, yes, decriminalize for survivors and victims, support the exit from the life, and then hold buyers and pimps accountable. And so those would be, in my view, the 3 main pillars of the equality model. So the good news with SAVIT is we all agree on one of those pillars, which is the decrim. But I think we need to work on, on
criminalizing the buyer.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and
exactly.
the seller.
Right. And the thing that's so interesting is, Project Cease, which was funded by Demand Abolition, has been in existence in, 12 to 15 other cities and counties around the nation. And so they've actually got some very good data, which is usually hard to come by, on what happens when you use this model in terms of buying, in terms of treatment. They've gotten much more creative about how you can actually help buyers leave. And not so much pimps, because they're pretty much flat out criminals, but it's, but there are buyers who were also naive about what was really going on or what was really behind their action. And some, can really choose a very different course. Others are doing it for darker reasons, and it's different. But again, some of these models are just are very positive and can really show a difference. And again, what we're losing the opportunity in Washtenaw County is to think about those newer approaches that actually have much broader positive impact.
Yeah, he claims that this is like the progressive, that sex work is real work, and women should have the right to do what they want with their bodies, but it's really not progressive. It's just more oppressive to women.
It's going backwards and undoing some of the work that those 4 ladies that sat to have tea that began the whole women's rights movement. It's like it's going back and totally completely reverse, going back in the wrong direction.
Yeah, exactly. Emily, I see there at least there's something going on in chat. I don't know, are there any in the last couple of minutes, any questions we should address or comments that others have? Otherwise, we can make our pitch for April 13th.
We can give you, we have some action items for anyone who wants to get involved and help us.
Oh, good. Excellent. So we're good.
I don't hear anything from Kendra, so maybe there's no questions out there. Well, definitely feel free. If you do have questions at any point, you can send us, you can send MAP an email. It's just info@map-mi.org. You can send us questions or chat with us on Facebook, Instagram. So what can be done to stop Washtenaw County Prosecuting Attorney Ellie Savitt and his misguided policy to decriminalize sex work? First and foremost, we want you guys to check out our website, stopsavitt.com, where there's tons more information and also some action items there. We have social media shareables that you can post to your social media accounts to help spread awareness. But definitely call Eli Savitt's office and ask that he repeal his policy on sex work. You can share with him. We have a script on the website if you don't feel comfortable making phone calls. There's a script provided for you on the Stop Savitt website. Spread awareness, social media, and definitely register to attend our upcoming virtual town hall. And that again is on April 13th. So it's on a Tuesday. I think that's next Tuesday, right? Next Tuesday at 7:00 p.m. to learn from and support local survivors. You can find the registration again on the stopsavitt.com website, on the MAP website, our event calendar, and also on our Facebook. Any other last
You hit it. You hit it.
Join us. I mean, I will say right now, this is the only policy for decriminalization of consensual sex in the state, but there are other counties that are watching this and other prosecuting attorneys who may or may not be interested in something similar. And so even if you don't live in Washtenaw County, first of all, victims could be procured from all over the state for that matter. And brought to Washtenaw County, or the policy could spread. So, keep your ear to the ground wherever you may be. So I hope it doesn't
contact your representatives.
Yep. So thank you. In closing, thank you so much for being with us, Peg. Thank you, Emily and Kendra, and all of our viewers. We're so glad that you were joining us. Spread this around. Send this link to those around you that you love, that you want to learn about this, and share a cup of hope.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, ladies, and thank you, everyone else, for attending today's Cup of Hope panel. We appreciate your time and hope you found it valuable. On behalf of Hope Against Trafficking and the Michigan Abolitionist Project, thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.